So let me start. I'm J Hodson. I'm a CISO in EMEA of Tanium. I want to start by saying we haven't co-sponsored the drinks, so it's all down to cloud conformity. So well done to those boys getting the drinks in. I've been doing various bits with Francesco over the last sort of 6 months, and he asked me to come on board with a CSA. And I suppose more immediately he said, hey, do you want to come and have a talk today and talk about visibility and control, talk about cloud security? So I'm the annoying one whose slides were like put in late yesterday. So this is kind of a combination of different things that I want to work on with the CSA over the next kind of 6 months or so. So let me have a look at this. Great. So who am I? Like I said, I'm a CISO EMEA of Tanium. I also work with various industry organisations. So I sit on the board of the IISP. I've been doing that for about 2.5 years now. That's certainly a partnership that I want us to grow with the CSA. Various pieces with Ntier as well. And one of the things I'm going to talk about today, it's actually half of my talk, is around demystifying some of the myths of public cloud computing. And Daniel before me actually has covered a few of these, so I'll be adding emphasis to some of that as well. So I'm going to start with perceptions of cloud. So I wrote a dissertation in 2016 talking about kind of neophobia, or this fear of change, problems with public cloud computing and taking that level of trust from your own data center and allowing other people to manage your data. So it wouldn't be your SecOps team, it would be the team of Amazon, it would be Google, et cetera, et cetera. And some of the challenges that brought, but also some of the BS. You know, if you take your data to someone else and someone else is managing it, is that more of a risk to your environment? So I want to cover a few of those points today, and I suppose it tied directly into a piece of work that I've been doing for Tanium at the moment. We produced a paper around the resilience gap, or understanding what cyber resilience is to the contemporary organisation. So how do you achieve resilience in the event of some form of business disruption? So we went away and interviewed, oh, my marketing team will kill me, I think it was about 5,000 CIOs and CISOs in global organisations, and said, what's stopping you from being resilient? And one of the major kind of feedback that we got was around cloud computing, around visibility, around transparency. So I'll share this report with the CSA guys. Please do reach out, grab a copy of it. I've included a couple of points, what I think are salient points, in this presentation, because I think it dovetails nicely into some of the stuff Michael was saying at the start of today, and also Daniel in the talk before. So of the 5,000 enterprises that we spoke with, 24% of them responded and said poor visibility of entry points in their environment was a challenge with business resilience. And that kind of broke down into 3 areas. So encryption, so increasingly organisations going to direct to internet. Historically, they had some form of, let's say, TLS inspection device on their network. They were able to intercept and look at traffic. They were experiencing challenges with ubiquitous TLS everywhere. That was one of the major challenges we saw. Cloud services was obviously another one. We hear the term shadow IT, organisations taking control of their infrastructure and their applications, the security team being maybe disenfranchised in a number of organisations, and also a reliance on CMDB. I mean, I work with CISOs and CIOs on a daily basis, and I hear reasonably regularly kind of a groaning, and oh, we don't trust the information in our CMDB, or oh, it's partially complete, we're not really sure if it's accurate for any period of time. And that's certainly, there's a few smiles around the room. That's certainly something I think is exacerbated by cloud. Absolutely. Who also is familiar with these 2 topologies? I think the one on my right is certainly this hub and spoke model. It's a model we've had for about the last 20 years. This is certainly one of the challenges we got feedback on around entry points to organisations. So the last 20 years, this is how we've built network infrastructure. We've had clients connecting to servers in a very kind of client-server orientated way, single message back, single message response. As we have a new threat, we built a new box, and I wrote somewhere about this being a pizza box architecture. But in a world where we need to get instantaneous telemetry from our endpoints, hub and spoke models don't really work. If half your infrastructure is hub and spoke, half of it's now in AWS somewhere, we see this reverse hairpinning of traffic between getting information from one to the other. So we invented this direct-to-internet model, and Daniel started talking about Beyond Corp, different approaches to SDP. I know the CSA has done a lot in that space. It's something that certainly I want to contribute to. But one of the challenges with direct-to-internet is most organisations aren't greenfield. So again, the previous talk, even Google has legacy. So if you're a brand new organisation, this kind of almost utopian direct-to-internet works, but what do you do with your controls in your data centre? How do you kind of get that hybrid model to work. It was a challenge when we asked CISOs and CIOs. This isn't a Tanium pitch, I know we're recording. This is an approach that we take to some of this via, we call this our linear chain, but kind of a peer-to-peer model. And again, we have this so it's flexible to work for cloud and micro-segmentation, but minimizing that requirement between client-server. So having a server ask a client a particular question, have that client then propagate and ask its neighbor the response to that, and then send that to the next neighbor on the chain. Again, previous talk, we talked about PowerShell and lateral movement. We do this via cryptographic signed messages. This is a model that I think scales and works for cloud. I want to do some work around kind of topologies and protocols with the CSA, incorporating this, and also how this would work with Beyond Corp as well. Another one that we saw, 34% of respondents said organizational complexity is the biggest barrier to business resilience. Now, this is what I initially thought of when I thought of organizational complexity. I thought we're seeing blockchain, we're seeing big data. You open up a Gartner research paper or Forrester, other research organizations are available, and we talk about a number of sensors and actuators online. We talk about machine learning and big data, and yes, CISOs are coming back, CIOs are coming back, and they're experiencing challenges with this, but more fundamentally than that, I think it's because we don't know what we're doing anymore. This, honestly, this is what I would call a traditional Ntier architecture that I grew up with, right? Kind of client, server. How many people in here did their MCSEs? Yeah, like loads of us, right? Everyone learned about Windows Server, SQL Server. Everyone learned about middleware components from IBM. And then we had our web tier, our presentation tier from Microsoft or from Apache. But we're not doing this anymore, right? But these are the guys who are protecting our environments. This is what we've all got experience in natively. Windows, Unix maybe, Oracle, Apache. This is the quickest, like I said, my slides were ready yesterday. I just looked at the latest reference architecture from Azure. So this doesn't look anything like anything I learned when I was very technical, when I was a systems engineer. So what I see happening and the feedback that I get from CISOs is we've got some incredibly intelligent people trained in native, on-prem, Exchange, SQL. Now they're expected to know about the latest and greatest serverless operating systems, Kubernetes management. It's crazy. Big table, big query, whatever it is. The way that we're doing things is seismically different. The principles of information security are the same, but the actual technologies we're using are starkly different. So this isn't the case for all organizations, but I'm seeing some nodding heads. You know, it's almost a round pegs in square holes challenges that we have at the moment, and I don't really see us getting much better at it. So that's my rant for the day. Anyway, start things off. We talked, or Lewis talked earlier, around kind of academic research. So in 2015, 2016, I wrote a paper for Holloway, and it was entitled Demystifying the Risks of Public Cloud Computing. And this was kind of based on a time of sort of IaaS, PaaS, SaaS. So what I'm going to talk about here is it's actually AWS and hypervisors, but the principles I think apply for some of the newer forms of AaaS that we're seeing today. So this is something that I wrote and I milk to death these days. But saying that clouds are like roads, and I think it's a metaphor that works pretty well for the way that we operate on-prem or off-prem. You don't have a standard set of controls, irrespective of that, right? So if you have a 30-mile-an-hour country lane, the controls that you would have to ensure you don't go too fast, or the requirements for speed control, are seismically different to an autobahn, for example, in Germany. And I think certainly when I said this initially in 2016, that didn't necessarily apply for cloud. People tried to apply a consistent set of controls to all cloud environments, irrespective of where they were, the data they were containing, and who had access to them. So why is that? Well, I think we're rubbish at this. So this is what I would call the cybersecurity risk equation. I haven't invented this. This is NIST used this. ISF IRAM uses this. Actors initiate events that exploit vulnerabilities. Okay, fairly common. Business impact is the ultimate end there. What is the confidentiality, integrity, availability requirements of information? That's kind of an information security side of things. Cyber would introduce brand reputation. I don't know, potentially death these days, which is rather morbid. But let's look at who's responsible for each of these. So actors initiating events that exploit vulnerabilities. If we didn't have any vulnerabilities, it doesn't matter about threat events. Daniel was talking about earlier about sophistication of attacks. More often than not, it's vulnerabilities that we've seen for the last, 3 or 4 years that actors are exploiting. ODAs are incredibly expensive. Very rarely are they used. But we as the cyber function are pretty good at this side of things. Actors, events, and vulnerabilities. We can talk about Spectre, Meltdown, cross-site request forgery, XSS. We're not so good, we're not so good at this side of things, classifying information. So this becomes a problem from a cloud perspective because we can design controls. We can look at AWS's latest guidance, Azure's latest guidance on how to control or, I suppose, restrict access to an S3 bucket. But if we don't know the business impact of that information, if we're not running BIAs, for example, we as the security function design controls that are commensurate with the classification of data. But too many organisations expect us to be classifying information and performing full risk management end to end. So that's a real challenge. So I took that and I looked at it from a cloud perspective and thought, okay, why, and bear in mind this is 2017, why are people scared of cloud? Why is this perception that on-prem is a better place for your data than cloud? And I thought, well, okay, actors, adversarial and accidental, same as on-prem. Threat events, listed a few there. You can look at NIST, you can look at ISF, you can look at the MITRE ATT&CK framework. The threat events are the same if you're on-prem or off-prem. So it must be the vulnerabilities. Now, and again, I'm going to get to the denouement too early of my talk, but the vulnerabilities for cloud are fundamentally the same as well, in the sense of you have a hypervisor, you have hardware that's running on some form of bare metal, you have virtual machines running on top of that. Now, if that's your challenge, if that's your objection, that's contemporary computing. That's not cloud per se. That's the way that people are managing and running technology. I don't know any organisation these days, really, that has physical Ntier architecture. Is that a fair comment? Yeah. You know, everyone's running virtualised environments. So this kind of challenge of cloud was much more a challenge around hypervisors and virtualisation. So are we challenging the fundamentals, the core kind of existence of computing today? The answer is yes, by the way. But so I went into a little bit more detail with this and thought, okay, what are some of the risks of cloud? You know, we hear, and we don't hear so much these days, but when I wrote this paper, we did. And Anissa, and it was way back when now, it was 2012, 2013, was it? 2012, 2013? Wrote this paper around cloud computing, benefits, risks, and recommendations. And the benefits you've read on any research paper the world over. But these were some of the risks. Now, please do take a look at these. How many of these are cloud specific to you? Vendor lock-in, okay, there's challenges around obsolescence in the cloud, but governance, compliance, reputation, resource exhaustion, you know, everyone in here can read. How many of these were actually unique to cloud? Because that's important. If we as a technical community are asserting one way or another that we should or shouldn't adopt Azure, GCP, AWS, we need to get our shit together and understand what the challenges actually are. So I did. So I took each one of these and looked at which was unique to cloud. So how many of these different vulnerabilities, because they're called risks, they were vulnerabilities. How many of them are unique to cloud? How many of them were exacerbated by cloud, as in the impact was worse or the opportunity was worse because there were lots of potential VMs running on the same box? And how many of them have we had in existence already, but potentially because we're now running them in the cloud, people see that the impact's worse and, you know, they're a bigger challenge. And the answers were quite interesting in that I think I had 4. So I think the actual categories, I think there were 29. And I think 4 of them I thought were exacerbated by cloud, and one of them was actually introduced by cloud, and that was one around subpoenas and location of data, because obviously if you're running on your own data centers, you can inherently control where information resides. If you're putting stuff in GCP or AWS and you don't pay for the privilege with like metadata tagging, it could go anywhere. You're recording this, I believe that's the case. So yeah, this is something, I've got 20 minutes, so this is something that I'll give out as a copy, but I break down multi-tenancy, which is one of the biggest challenges for cloud computing, and try to understand how many of those issues were pertaining to resource isolation, because that seems to be the biggest challenge here. Everyone seems to be very het up that technically speaking, if you installed a kernel level hypervisor, like a level -1, you could technically grab memory from different virtual machines. and I'm ruining my next 3 or 4 slides, but that is technically true, but the exploits that you would need to use, the vulnerabilities that you would need to take advantage of, it's incredibly bloody difficult to do it, and there are just easier ways to steal information from people in 2019 or 2016, 2017, as was the case here. So this isn't following a stride methodology, this isn't PASTA, this was just a very kind of rudimentary model that I used to establish the likelihood of somebody actually actioning on their objectives in the cloud. And there's a lot of documentation that goes behind this, and many a cleverer person than I have actually done some academic studies with empirical evidence of how hard it is to achieve coexistence on a specific bare metal hypervisor in AWS. Yes, you can do it. Yes, it makes a very good black hat talk, but it's just really difficult. I think the percentage likelihoods in the studies that I think it was Riston Part et al. Did in 2009, I think 2009. I think it was a 40% success rate around achieving co-residence, but something like a 9% one for actually getting the same infrastructure before you actually manage to get it on the same hypervisor itself. So there are just much easier ways to steal information in the modern world. So this whole kind of objection to cloud and these challenges associated with, should I keep things on or off-prem? If you actually break down the actual act, so the objective, and then do any form of threat modeling and start to document the controls at each level. So here, step 1, map the cloud. I think in 2019 now, resource groups by default have inbound traffic on AWS turned off. I think that's the case. Yeah, I'm pretty confident that's the case. So this first step is completely mitigated at phase 1. So we very much in our industry, I think, obsess on impact without necessarily understanding the steps that are necessary that you need to go through for some of this stuff. And this is what I did. I took those steps and I used, what did I use? ISF, IRAM, as a methodology for risk management to look at the likelihood of initiation and likelihood of success of some other threats in our industry. So on one hand, multi-tenancy exploitation, incredibly difficult, low likelihood of a success. If you mess up with a kernel level hypervisor exploit, it blue screens a box. That's pretty obvious, and that happens fairly regularly. So why wouldn't you just send someone an email and get them to click on something, per our previous speaker? To pivot slightly, these are some other things that I really want to answer as part of my membership of the CSA. These are challenges that I think pertain to cloud, and they're questions that I get on a semi-regular basis. How do I get my business units to care about their data in the cloud? If anyone, that's actually a question to everyone here. It's not one I necessarily have an answer to, but business impact analysis, data classification, incredibly important. How do we provide that value to the DevOps community? I mentioned earlier about various people in the room being MCSE certified. How many people know how to secure continuous integration and continuous development pipelines? How many people understand how to work with Jenkins and Jira? Not many that I speak to, the round peg, square holes challenge. I'll pick up on another one of these. How quickly can we apply great glass patches? And the metrics we have around cybersecurity in the cloud are possibly slightly skewed. The important ones. How quickly can we deploy a patch? How many vulnerabilities do we have in our estate? They're critically important as operational tenants for any cybersecurity program, but they're not as sexy as machine learning or malware forensics, but in my opinion, they're much more important. And the other one's regulation. Which regulations do we need to adhere to in the cloud? Can we have information in different locations, in different geographies, in different regions? And how do we train staff? How do we train staff when we are getting new technologies come out day after day? How do we ensure that those people outside of cybersecurity and outside of IT ops understand their responsibilities? Because many a truism said security is everyone's responsibility, but I think we as the security function need to do a much better job of educating our users for cloud consumption and technology more generally. No idea how I'm doing for time, but a few takeaways from this, and these are things I'm going to build on as part of my CSA membership now. Cloud computing is often considerably more secure than traditional computing. Now, I go back to Holloway on a regular-ish basis and discuss this one. It's not always the case. We've talked about this litany of S3 bucket exploits. We talk about misconfigured X, Y, and Z. But if you're an organization who has limited budget and limited resource for CapEx in your environment, marketplaces in AWS and Azure allow the smaller organizations to spin up virtual instances of firewalls, of IPSs, of various different toys and trinkets they couldn't afford to POC and deploy in their environment. So bear that in mind. Also know your cloud. These are just two really quick examples that I pulled together. This is the Open Security Architectures pattern for cloud, for public cloud computing. Something I did as part of my dissertation was I haven't got a light on this, annoyingly, take each of these different steps on the left-hand side here, break down whose responsibility they are in your environment. It's something that you can then align policies and standards to. And the one on the right, this is actually from Microsoft, but it reminds me very much of Amazon's shared responsibility model, right? Of they're responsible for security of the cloud. You're responsible for security in the cloud. And that in the cloud goes for kind of IaaS, PaaS, SaaS, Lambda, microservices, whatever you're working with. Understand what you've got. Understand the data that's traversing your different cloud environments. And what was this? This was a risk meta model that I put together. This is really helpful, I think, for people outside of a cybersecurity community. So sit down with them and understand the constituent parts of public cloud, understand who's responsible for each of those, and break down controls and capabilities against each of those areas. So that's also something that I think we could probably update for 2019 and start to kind of distribute something in that space. And if you do nothing else, I think I called this talk about public cloud kind of security conservation. I think it kind of breaks down into two areas, right? So your phase one, before you do anything with cloud, before you consider which form factor you're going to use, which service model, look at understanding your data. So where does it exist? How important is it? Who has access? What are the phases of that? Where is it created? Where is it processed? Where is it deleted? Phase one. And phase two is just understand your controls. I had a CISO say to me very recently, he said, Chris, which IPS should I buy? And I said, well, I've got no idea why you're buying an IPS. You know, what is it there to do? Is it there to mitigate a particular threat? Are you there as a compensating control for a particular vulnerability? Understand why you have these very expensive technical solutions in your environment. And, oh yes, there's an awful shameless plug for a book that I've just written here, unfortunately. So I hate to leave on that note. But yeah, a number of the points that I've kind of talked about and glossed over almost today are documented in a book. So yeah, by all means, check that one out as well. I think, and I'm on time, yeah, I think that's it. If anyone's got any questions.
Thank you, Chris.